Hello and welcome to the Lively Faith Podcast. I'm your host, the Reverend Nathan Stomberg, and today I'm joined by my co-host, the Reverend Mark Galloway, and we're going to be talking about the election, political turmoil, and how Christians should think about it. So at the time of this recording, we're pre-election. This episode is going to come out, we assume, right around the election in November, and regardless of how it goes, whether Republicans win, whether Democrats win, we're offering a corrective to how Christians should respond. And we're going to be making reference to an article written in the Catholic Thing by Robert Royal. And I really want to kick us off with that, where he says to this effect, what should Christians do when they don't recognize the country or the church that they live in anymore? And he offers these two virtues that we need to cultivate. We need to focus on faithfulness and perseverance. And so that's what I want to talk about today, how we can cultivate faithfulness and perseverance amid a chaotic political landscape, a rapidly changing culture. I think it's far too easy for us to get caught up in ruminating on political wins and losses, and it's going to drive us insane. And looking ahead at this time of the election presidential race, we're going to need every last shred of theological sanity and faithfulness and steadfastness, because the world that we once knew no longer exists, politically speaking. Regardless of who wins this thing, if Trump wins, for example, there's no 100% fix to the problems that we face systemically. So we're going to be talking about all things related to that today. And if you made it this far, again, please, we invite you to give us a like, subscribe if you haven't already. We very much appreciate your support. So Mark, do you have anything to add to that? I think really the thesis here, faithfulness and perseverance are the virtues that we need to be looking to. And maybe we explain a little bit what we mean about cultivating those virtues versus dwelling on political wins and losses.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked about it many times. With the decay of Judeo-Christian principles being the center of Western civilization and American culture, and really the abandonment of the vast majority of Americans holding their faith as the centerpiece of their life, this void has been filled by all kinds of other activities, and social media has just rushed in and filled like actual knowledge of Judeo-Christian understanding, theology, history with sound bites from TikTok, right? And that's how people think. So they get their information in these 30-second sound bites, and they turn that into as if it's inspired gospel. And they're so misinformed about reality, history, human anthropology, that they're ill-equipped to deal with the myriad of complicated issues that confront all of us. And they're so much more sophisticated than the issues our grandparents came out of, even the greatest generation facing.
It's true.
And, you think in the technology, as we all know, the technology in our cell phones like a gazillion times more powerful than what they had on Apollo 13. And it's such an overwhelming tidal wave. I think the average person, isn't informed enough. They're ignorant about it, and it's so beyond them that they just ignore it. They fill the void with almost like fantasy.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of putting it. It's a willful ignorance in some cases, or just ignoring the issues where you. Right. I like the image of filling the void, and you're turning to entertainment, which is so easy for us to access nowadays, where it's a coping mechanism. It's an opiate where it allows us to very easily distract ourselves from having to engage with the difficult realities all around us and the difficult realities in our own lives too. That very oftentimes, like if you're if you're talking to someone or counseling someone about dealing with some sort of addictive behavior, right? One of the questions that you could reasonably ask is, well, what are you running from? What are you hiding from?
Right.
And so often we turn to these things, and social media entertainment is just one such example where, well, I'm going to unplug from the rest of the world and I'm going to watch my favorite show or doom scroll through TikTok or something else, just because it's so much easier mentally, right? It's so much easier. It takes too much energy. Speaking from their experience, right? Too much energy to possibly engage with all of these things that are going on.
And I think that's so true. I think it's simultaneously, it's like coming down from a drug high for people, right? Because you've escaped.
Also true.
But then all of a sudden you wake up the next day, and I mean, I've just struggled this in myself. You look at the world, you look at all the things that are happening, and I say to myself, where's the truth, the beauty, and the joy in the world?
Yeah.
Because you have to be really a person of faith, prayed up, and understanding that this is all passing and that there's something greater for us beyond it, or you won't find it. And so,
absolutely.
And so then you just go deeper. It's like a drug habit, right? You just go deeper into denying reality and going into this false reality.
Oh, I would say that it absolutely is like a drug habit. You're addicted to dopamine at that point. All social media apps, 24/7 news cycle, they're all designed to give you very quick, repeated hits of dopamine. Mm-hmm. And so when you're neck deep in political articles and the W's and L's of your side versus the other side, it gets you enraged. It gets your hide up very quickly, and there's adrenaline, there's dopamine associated with that. So it is an addictive behavior. And when you come down from that, it's regular life seems boring.
Right. And we were talking before we went on air. It's like it's created within families. We talked about some situation in our own families. Josh, we talked about people we work with and people we've been friends with since we were kids. It's such a sickness is that if people disagree with us, we can't stand them. They're our enemies. Yeah. And so there's no civility. There's no ability to just converse about the fact that in a free republic, you have the right to disagree about things in civil discourse without causing harm to one another. But we're moving rapidly beyond the ability. Well, let me say, we're moving rapidly towards, in my opinion, towards a position where we could be in danger of hurting one another.
Yeah, it's troubling to think about. And what's even more troubling is you see the same behavior among supposedly regenerate Christians, talking about people that we know.
Right.
And I think that is one of the big focuses for us here, right, is that as Christians, regenerate people, we need to be thinking beyond this immediate tribalism. I am reminded of an article that I recently read. I don't know if it was in the Atlantic or elsewhere, but it was talking about the rise of their children going no contact with their parents. That's a trend, and there's whole support groups opening up now about people going no contact with their parents because of these political style disagreements. And they're generally people who have deconstructed their faith. They were raised in Christian households, and because of the nature of political discourse, the quote unquote safe topics on which they can agree upon with their parents and immediate family are so small and they're shrinking, it's easier for them, speaking of their experience, to totally just disconnect from their family and not engage with them at all versus either trying to find common ground or speaking about values they have in common, which of course those values have eroded away without the church present. But that it all ties back into our inability to be able to have polite political discourse with one another.
Look what's going on in London, and the decay and the cultural clash, right? Historic clash, socio-political, religious clash. right, the British Empire was the greatest thing on earth at the beginning of the 20th century. I'm not sure you can, well, I don't believe you can recover it. You cannot recover a national sense of commonality under those conditions. And it's just going to continue to move further and further away. I was talking to a good friend, clergyman friend of mine, this week over the phone, and he's kind of a typical Anglophile, and he says, "What do you think the greatest challenge is?" I go, "Here's the challenge: is that you have a birth rate that's like 1.1 in England, which means if in 50 years you really won't have any Caucasians, so you have this European, despite Brexit, you have this European, this complete inundation of migration. London's basically an Islamic city, and yet you have a parliamentary system and the head of state is a Christian monarch.
So these two things are not compatible with one another.
Right. How do you sustain that? How do you, you can dress it up like, the pig with lipstick for a while, but how do you sustain it? It's not possible.
Well, it's like that great poet W.B. Yeats, who you've quoted many times, yes. W.B. Yeats, that the center cannot hold. He was English, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and to that end, right, I think, and maybe this is a bit of a tangent, I almost see, or it concerns me when I see Christians and others who almost out of a fatalism seem to wish to accelerate getting to a point of severe conflict, of tearing it all down, that it would be much better to say, oh, well, to hell with it, let's just start fighting already. I think we can think of people we know who almost seem to be willing conflict into existence, again, out of, I think, a desire to assert a superiority of one side over another side. I don't know. Am I making sense with that?
Yeah, you are. And I think the dilemma for what's left of any Christian brain that still works in the West is that the inability out of fear or rejection to say, listen, the greatest civilization in the history of the world was Christendom. It produced the most freedom, the greatest success, jurisprudence, the most economic prosperity, the best rights for women, right? All of these things. Not that it was perfect, but it dwarfs any culture that's ever existed. And we can't even say it. Instead, we're saying we should break it all down and start with some kind of democratically decided common beginning point or something, right? And of course, which will never work because you'll never gain consensus because, quite frankly, Islam will never do that, right? Their goal is world domination. And any Westerner who doesn't think that, you don't have to be a religious bigot. You just have to follow the logistics of what they believe that's their goal. And that's what's happening, right? That's what's happening in Europe. Europe's done as a culture, right? The European Union it's really a farce, right? It can't sustain itself. It can't sustain itself economically. It can't produce enough energy to take care of itself, so it has to kiss up to the communists and everybody else to get natural gas and oil and all these things. And they don't have enough people, so they're going to have to continue to bring in people of different cultures, which is going to change the whole demographics of the entire continent. And we can't deal with truth.
Right. So to your earlier point, I want to refer back to a few lines in the Robert Royal article, which are really appropriate. a Christian knows that there's a time for reinvigorating and a time when the task is virtuously enduring until God sorts things out when we've gotten ourselves to the point where we're helpless. Yet we also need to try understanding our moment. At least in America, we may have grown too confident in the belief that our system is the natural order of things and can be quickly recovered. Not so. It took a great good fortune, wise founders, and happy circumstance to make it as remarkable as it has been, but no political order is forever.
Yes. I think that line, and I'm circling right now, no political order is forever. I don't believe the average American ever contemplates that. And because they don't believe that.
Right.
And again, we have such a dearth of people who are students of history. There's nothing going on currently that's new under the sun, right? You go back through history. The Roman Empire collapsed, right? So the Visigoths come 461, Rome falls. And it's a dark time. But was it the end of the world? Was it the end of civilization?
No, they didn't cease to exist.
No. And what saved civilization? The church, right? It saved literature, it saved the memory of the past, right? The fact that it was literate, it saved everything, right? And out of it burgeoned the great Renaissance and the Middle Ages and then medieval period and so forth and so on. And so when chaos collapses, it's not the worst thing because it's like nature. It's like when wildfires take care of things, it's actually good. And what reemerges is new life, God's recreation of the new day.
Natural order of things.
And I just think about it, right? So Jesus is born into Roman Palestine. The zealots are like, we got to kill all the Romans, right, so that we can have this theistic state, which was never God's plan, right? Jesus didn't come to start a country or a state. He came to save souls and to bring the kingdom of God into existence, which transcends time and space. In fact, the earth is passing away. It won't last forever. The average person, especially American, clings to this because they don't believe in immortality. This has to be heaven for them, right? This has to be their reality. You see the fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of the British Empire after the First World War, right? The end of all the European monarchies. Oh, the world's done. No, it wasn't done. The rise of the Cold War, the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union will bring the end of the world. It didn't, because truth, perseverance on the American side defeated the Soviet system, right, with the help of Margaret Thatcher and John Paul II and others. So there's nothing new under the sun. There's been these massive, epic changes and upheavals throughout the course of just since the birth of Christ. It seems to me you've heard me talk about it your whole life since you were a child. It's like the inability of Americans to deal with reality, right? Debt. The debt of this country is far more of an existential threat than China, Russia, anything else, right? When you debt yourself out to the point where you can't pay back and you collapse, right? It's not the fault of any other ethnicity or country. It's your own fault. It's utter stupidity, right?
Yeah.
Which was completely preventable. But again, the average American doesn't even give it a thought, right? Every 65 days, we're chinging $1 trillion onto the debt, right? Which is 1,000 billions.
It's a lot of billions.
Right? And the average American goes, oh, whatever, we just can print some more money, right? And I was just talking to a relative going on about, if we elect the wrong person or the wrong party, they're going to take away our Social Security. And I said to her, I go, it's not going to matter. I go, Social Security is completely unfunded right now, right? It's a complete myth, right?
It's a pyramid scheme.
It's a pyramid scheme. And they said, I pay FICA tax. I go, that doesn't mean anything, right? I said, right, the debt's 8-9 trillion dollars now. The fact is, it's so staggering. The debt's really around 100 trillion because
Right.
Social Security is 70 trillion unfunded, right? Yeah. And so everybody's like, hey, Josh, get Social Security at 62, right? It's like, it's 70 trillion unfunded, right? It's never going to happen, right? It will all collapse on itself. And so these, I love to listen to politicians, and who's our friend? The Jewish commentator, the young man.
Like Ben Shapiro?
Ben Shapiro was in front of Congress a couple months ago, and this, I don't remember his name. He does not impress me whatsoever. He was a Democratic.
Is it Adam Schiff, I think?
No, it was, the guy who begins with H, his name, I think.
Oh, is it Hakeem Jeffries?
No, it was,
okay.
It was a cocaine, but he's going on, and our friend just simply says to him, he goes, your problem is you just can't tell the truth. You don't like me because I'm saying to America, listen, we don't have any money and we can't fund these things. So you going on about how this party is going to try to steal Social Security from Americans isn't true because you and I know it's going to be broken, unsolvable within 10 years, even if you keep borrowing money. So the difference is I'll tell the truth to the American people. They won't like me because I'm telling the truth, and you'll just keep lying to them. But
right.
it's still going to happen, right? And so we as believers, and certainly the church, the truth sets us free.
Yes, absolutely.
And we have, why we don't have the courage is beyond me. Why the average clergyman doesn't have the courage to tell the truth is, besides discouraging, it's just pathetically beyond my capacity to articulate at this point.
Well, I think building off of your point, right, going back to, put aside the idea of whether the right person or the wrong person wins or loses. What would you say to the Christian? Let's play both sides here because we don't know at this time who's going to win the election. We'll start with the Republican side. What do you say to the Christian as a corrective if Trump wins the presidential race or if the Republican side wins the presidential race? What is the advice? What do Christians need to keep in mind?
Well, as we talked off here, it's again, the average voter, I guess I can call him that. I think the average, very uninformed person is like either the Republican candidate wins or the Democratic candidate wins, and then if you either like or hate the person, the world's going to end, or this gigantic tidal wave of utopia is about to crash over us, right? But first of all, presidents are not kings. They have limited power under the Constitution. They don't, in fact, it's more important who controls Congress than it is who the president is. And either way, let's say the Democrats win. It's unlikely they may control one house. They may control one house of Congress. They're likely to lose both, and it's going to be very difficult for that person to pass any legislation. So we'll just continue to do what we do, continuing resolutions on the budget and a bunch of executive fiats to temporarily kiss up to your base to make them happy, right? Which won't solve anything, just increase the debt and won't fix a single issue. Neither candidate, for Christians, our hope is never in politics. The great line from the psalmist. I quote him in an article I recently wrote for your magazine. Like, we don't put our strength in the strength of the horse.
Yes.
In the army, right? We put our hope is in the Lord God, the creator of heaven and earth. And that was true when it was written 3,000 years ago. It's true today. Even if you elected whoever, some kind of version, whatever your political persuasion is, if you elected like the greatest example of FDR, taking away all his flaws, and he became the perfect person, or Abraham Lincoln on the other side, that person, if they could do everything within their intellectual and God-given abilities, they couldn't solve these problems if they had 4 or 5 consecutive terms.
True.
It's too complicated. It's, you can't, we've been accruing this since World War One, right?
Yeah.
We've been accruing debt and all these things, right? And Americans just don't want to hear that.
I would also add not only the systemic nature of the problem, but also that the problem is spiritual in nature. That there is no political solution to what is a deep spiritual sickness on both sides of the aisle.
Right.
Especially if both sides of the aisle increasingly give themselves over to allowing the sacrifice of our children in the womb. God will pay judgment upon us equally for that.
Exactly. Well, we've not the regenerate, right? But though we're becoming more and more of a majority, that Americans spend their whole life, I'm speaking in generalities here, but Americans spend their whole life ignoring mortality.
Yes.
Right? So we get facelifts, we never let our hair go gray, we do everything to pretend we're, half the people I shouldn't say that's not true, but I've buried many a person who's a facsimile of the human being they once were. Right? And so that's how we go on. You know this, right? We have friends in the business, right? Funeral homes have become like this complete mirage of what reality is. It's like this party. Oh, we're having a beach theme at Uncle Jim's funeral. And it's like, what the hell is going on, right? And it's so a country that doesn't, a people, a civilization that won't even admit mortality, can never deal with reality, and is not interested in fixing the problems that cause anxiety, grief, and the downfall of the common good. They're not interested in that. They want immediate gratification. As long as however long I live, I'm happy. And I think I get cash in my pocket and nobody's going to bother me. I don't really care what happens to the next generation.
Yeah.
That is the country we live in.
Yep.
Right? And there's so few people that will even begin to say that. And the ones that do get lots of hate mail like me. Right? And that's how it is.
Yeah.
And that's why I think when the Lord put on your heart to have this podcast, it remains utterly unique. And we have friends that do podcasts, and they're they do great apologetics. A lot of them, of our friends do Catholic apologetics and so forth, and they do great work. But they don't have the courage to really tackle these issues.
They avoid the issues when they become too inconvenient.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, so taking it back to my question then, it sounds like the answer is the same, the corrective is the same for both sides of the aisle. What do Christians do with whatever this election result is? It's faithfulness and perseverance. If one side wins, it's not going to bring in utopia and it's not going to solve all your problems. If the other side wins, yeah, maybe on a practical level things are worse, but the sky isn't going to fall immediately as you may imagine that it will.
Right. And again, it's back to the future to get to reality, right? The famous movie from the 80s, Christians from the get-go, right? Jesus himself, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, render to God what is God's, right? And then there's always the balance of the scriptures, as we know from the Acts of the Apostles. The government can say what it wants, but even if it means we have to die a modest death, we will follow God's law before we'll follow an unjust law made by man, right? And that's the case with abortion and Christian anthropology, all of these things, right? Now, There's only going to be a remnant that's going to do that, but God only needs a remnant.
Yeah.
The remnants from going all the way back from those who came back from Babylon, right, after 50 years in exile. It was the remnant who rebuilt the temple. It's always been the remnant.
It's always a remnant.
We're
It's never a majority.
We're a remnant. Anybody who doesn't, any regenerate person doesn't think they're a remnant, and the world hates them, is getting bad advice from somebody, right? We just continue to do what God calls us to do, right? You share the truth in love. You never look to disrespect the human dignity of the person you disagree with, though they're going to go out of their way to do it to you. If it means you have to give your life, you give your life. Now, we're not there yet. It will be there in the future someday. You keep persevering. You love your neighbor as yourself. You share the gospel in both overt and subtle ways, generation after generation. Teach your children the faith. Teach them there's nothing more important in life than knowing Christ as Savior. It's more important than where you live, where you go to school, how much money you save. That's the key, right?
Yeah.
And then all of these changes we talked about, empires will come and go, economics will come and go, history and the ebb and flow of it will come and go, but the gospel and the truth of Christ's saving redemption will always endure. He promised it will. And that's what we, and far more of us, hundreds of thousands of more clergy, need to be saying it before they just can constantly wax on less than eloquently in their pulpits about their political issues and social justice and all these
Right.
other things, right? So it's really not, there's nothing rocket science
It's not
about it.
complicated.
What's hard is, do you have the courage, do you have the mettle to stand and do it? And the fact is, very few do.
Yeah.
Very, very
Yeah.
few.
I was so encouraged writing my article about Justin Martyr for the first edition of Lively Faith magazine, which should be in the mail by the time this episode comes out. So if you've read it and enjoyed it, please get in touch with us. We'd love to add you to our mailing list, totally free of charge. But it's been incredible spending this time with Saint Justin, because he really is a saint for our times as
Right.
well,
And
right? The Roman Empire, there's nothing new under the sun.
And he's living in 150s, 160s.
Yeah, he's living in the mid 2nd century AD. So the Roman Empire is at its peak. It seems like the Roman Empire is eternal. So he's not like Saint Augustine, who's living
Right.
on the back end during its decline.
Christianity's still illegal.
Christianity is still illegal, and in his first apology, which he writes to Emperor Antoninus Pius, who I probably butchered the pronunciation, during the opening dialogue of this letter, which he is writing in order to defend his fellow Christians who are being slandered for political reasons. So there was a common practice in the Roman Empire at that time for the pagan peoples to write slander and submit slander to the political authorities against Christians, accusing them of being atheists, right? Because they were polytheistic to the nth degree. So the Christian monotheism was like atheism to them, but also
Cannibals.
and also they thought that they were cannibals. So they made up these terrible slanders and lies about the Christian Eucharistic rite and their rites of worship, about cannibalism and incest and all sorts of terrible things. And so St. Justin is writing to the emperor saying, hey, look, judge us on the content of our character and not by unsubstantiated words. But he goes on and makes this brilliant discourse arguing for the validity of Christianity and using reason and logic and appealing to the manners of philosophy, which he was very familiar with and were very popular of the day.
time, yeah.
So here's an example of a guy who is using the tools at his disposal to boldly make a defense of the faith to a hostile culture, which was unafraid to kill Christians for political expediency. But the line, what I'm getting to is the line at the opening of this discourse in Justin's first apology was, he says, and you may kill us, but we will never die. You can do whatever you want to us, but we are totally convinced of the truth of the gospel, and we're never going to die because of it. so we're not bothered by you.
It's so true, right? Tertullian's great line, right? The blood of the martyrs is
The seed of the
the
church.
seed of the church. Thank you for helping my shrieking brain here. Every despot thinks they're going to be the exception to that rule, right? Putin thinks he is. China thinks it is. Of course, Nazism, Stalinism, they all thought it was. And all they ever did was increase the strength of the Christian faith, right? And that's what this Marxist, distorted, ridiculously, philosophically unsound, to say the least, version of Marxism that has overtaken the progressive left in America is not going to eradicate America of Christianity. They'll get. It's like the battle of the bulge, right?
Yeah.
They're thinking, oh, look how much we've pushed back in, right? We're pushing them back, but of course it's going to lose because Christianity will always has a rebirth because it's supernatural, right? And the government can. It's just like the Declaration, right? Our rights and freedom doesn't come from the government; it comes from God. It can't be taken
Period.
away, right? It's eternal. It's immutable, and it will always reemerge. The remnant will always reemerge, and the example, the courage, the faith of the remnant always has more influence than those who are trying to oppress your rights. Now, it will live through generation. You and I won't see all the great results of, hopefully, our faithfulness, but it will happen. I've zero doubt
Absolutely.
that in time eternity, we're going to meet new saints that we never knew in our lifetimes because we were separated by centuries.
Yeah.
But they're going to know of our examples because we follow in that great train which no man can count.
Isn't that so cool to think about?
Yes.
And again, referencing back to the magazine, the theme for this first edition is For All the Saints, which is pulled from that famous hymn. The tune for that hymn in Latin is Sine Nomine,
Yes.
which is without a name, with reference to that great verse where the author references this great heritage of the saints, many of whose names we do not know. And to think that for all of the great saints with a capital S that we remember and we admire, there are multitudes more whose names we do not know, who we equally owe our own faith to, if not more so, with the heritage
they're
we've
more
received.
important, right?
Yeah.
They did it anonymously, and there's millions more of them than those who remember the annals of the church. I'm really grateful that you gave me some assignments, but the one I'm still working on, and I apologize, it's become such a personal with the issues going on in my own life, health-wise, and my own mortality, but just for my audience, I'm working on. He's known as John Cosin or John Cosin. I like to pronounce it Cosin, but John Cosin was a priest of the 16th century in England. He was born short period at the end of the Elizabeth I's reign, and he was one of the first adherents. His great mentor was the great Lancelot Andrews, the great Bishop of Winchester, the chief translator of the King James Version, the great court preacher to Elizabeth, maybe one the most learned man of his time, who was not a Calvinist. He was an Arminian and believed in the free will. And for him, the center of Christian life, even though he was the best preacher of his day, the center of the Christian life for him was the Holy Eucharist. Right? And so the great, as I know, the Caroline Divines, Bishop Overall, which was his mentor.
And the Caroline Divines being under King Charles.
King Charles the First, right? And then the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, who like Charles II, lost his head to the Rump Parliament. And Cosin was their protege, and that would have been their success. He would have been the Archbishop of Canterbury, but of course Cromwell comes over, the Civil War comes, Cromwell forces win, Charles II has to go into exile, the oppression of the Cromwellian life in England. The Church of England is outlawed for 15 years. But Cosin goes to France, and he is the chaplain to the English court. Remember, Charles II's married to a Roman Catholic.
Yes.
Right? And so he's the chaplain to these Anglicans in exile. He has no idea, right? His country's gone, as he knows it. In my opinion, the country as we know it's gone. The country I grew up in, the culture I grew up in, is gone.
Yes.
Right? The church and the churches, I'll add an ES to it, that I knew, loved, and dedicated my life to since I was 20 are gone.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Anglicanism, the Church of England has collapsed. The Anglican Communion's a mess. The Roman Catholic Church is collapsing. Right? And no offense to our good friends, Roman Catholic brothers and sisters who listen to this podcast. They know it. Historians know it. It will have to reemerge in a whole different way sometime in the future. And its demise still has a century to go. Right? But Cosin lived in this time. And yet he stays absolutely faithful to who he is. He had absolute confidence that the Lord had called him to be a priest. To the providence of history or accident, he was an Anglican priest. He stayed absolutely faithful to the whole Eucharist as it had been inherited from the Elizabethan settlement, 1559, and not one word of that Eucharistic rite had been changed. But Cosin was the greatest liturgist of his time. The only Anglican liturgist more important in the history of the Anglican world was Cranmer himself.
Yeah.
But I would argue for contemporary reasons in history, Cosin's even more important. Because it was Cosin who, while he was in exile, and previous to that, before they cut off Laud's head and Charles was murdered, Cosin was already revising the Elizabethan liturgy, not the text, none of Cranmer's text, but the rubrics. The rubrics which became more Laudian, and that is they became more Arminian High Church. And so it was ultimately Cosin's work, which he never knew would come to fruition. It's called the Durham Book. It was a 1619 version of the Elizabethan book that he put all his notes in. Think about it. He doesn't get out of exile in 1662. He started working on that book in 1619.
Wow. Think about that.
Right? And so in the Savoy Conference, which you're aware of,
43 years.
the Savoy Conference was after Charles II is reinstated to the throne, when they finally realized Cromwell's a little oppressive. This isn't working too well, right? And so the Church of England is brought back. Charles II is brought back, but in a completely different capacity from his father, who lived his life under his understanding and the nation's of the absolute right of the divine right of kings. And Charles is the first king that is a parliamentarian king, right? The parliament becomes the strongest. The House of Commons becomes the strongest power, and the king works under the English Constitution, which isn't real.
It's not written.
It's not written, right? It's all by precedent. And then finally, Cosin comes back, never knowing this would ever happen. He comes back from exile. He's appointed the Bishop of Durham, which is the fourth most important seat in the Church of England's hierarchy. But he's the main secretary at the Savoy Conference with the Puritans who have been running religion under the Cromwellian dictatorship, meet with the Anglican bishops, and they had to work out this new liturgy, and it's Cosin's ideas that triumph. And so the English Reformation, which started all the way back through Henry, through his son Edward VI, through Mary, through Elizabeth, doesn't reach its conclusion until 1662. So it takes over 110 years. It's nothing like the Protestant Reformation on
Not at
the
all.
continent. And the crown's reestablished. Charles is king, and it's a 1662 book that finally puts its ultimate imprimatur on what Anglicanism is about. And it's an overstatement, but it's Cranmer's words in his absolutely unprecedented English prose. But it's Cosin's rubrics that interpret, not Cranmer's commentary, but Cosin's commentary and rubrics that give definition to the Book of Common Prayer. And that's what is still the official Book of Common Prayer to this day. And that's why it has the most unique place in Christendom. It's this amalgamation of Protestant doctrine of justification by faith, but where the sacraments are absolute means of grace that hold central place in the life and worship of the church. And so I have this tremendous affinity to Cosin before you asked me to write.
Yeah.
He didn't have a country, he didn't have a church, and yet he never wavered, never knowing if he'd ever return to England. In fact, his son converted to Catholicism and became a Roman Catholic priest. And he, unbeknownst to him in God's providence, he does return to England. He does become the Bishop of Durham. He becomes the most prolific and important liturgical figure in Anglican history since Cranmer's time. And he becomes one of the great bishops in English history.
Wow.
Right? And to me, the lesson for you and I is we don't know what's going to happen in our lifetimes. We don't even know if the efforts we're putting forth and all the other faithful clergymen across the denominational spectrums, it doesn't matter if it happens in our lifetimes. That's not what God's asking us to do.
That's so true.
God's asking you to write your notes in the whatever your book is, in the 1619 book. Write those notes so that you can pass it on to a future generation that's going to have the courage, the acumen, and the determination to pass on the faith to a new regenerate remnant that will allow the faith to persevere. And our job isn't to worry whether we're remembered in history or whether we're famous, but that we one day have the honor of being a part of that great cloud of witnesses that nobody can count, that is cheering on the saints in their generation and time. And to do that, we have to be egoless. We can't be like, in my opinion, far too many of the evangelists on cable and everything else that yakking and talking, right? Be quiet, be still, and know that God is God. That's what we're being called to do. I think that's what Royal's telling us in this article, right?
Faithfulness and perseverance.
From his Roman Catholic perspective. I have tremendous respect for Robert Royal. Just to caveat, what I find so fascinating is, I went to University of Rhode Island on athletic scholarship. I stayed 5.5 semesters, did nothing, had no idea what I was doing except I was there to be an athlete, transferred to Rhode Island College. And Robert Royal was a professor at Rhode Island College.
Really?
At the time.
Wow. One of those neat accidents of history.
This kind of humble place. He taught very similar to what I studied, sociology. And he ends up, moving on by God's providence these other ways. And he's one of the great apologists of the Catholic Christian or the Christian faith period in the Western world right now. So it's a wonderful string. So thank you for giving me the Cosin assignment. Simon, I'm still not done with it because it's really been a tremendous emotional struggle. Because I realize that's my life. I've been an orphan for a long time, right? I've had the honor of being defrocked by the Episcopal Church, Anglican Church in North America, because I don't agree with the ordination of women. I've been a homeless Anglican for a long time.
This is true.
Right, 18 years. And but I looked at Cosin, and if I could be half the man Cosin was, I would give God all the glory. So I know it took a long time to say that, but it's just very powerful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I don't have anything to add to that. Just amen. Praise be to Christ. I'll wrap us up then with a quote from St. Paul's letter to the Romans that Robert Royal used, and we can take it from there. St. Paul says, "We have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we also have obtained our introduction by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we celebrate in hope of the glory of God. And not only this, but we also celebrate in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance proven character, and proven character hope. And hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out within our hearts through the Holy Spirit."
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Faithfulness and perseverance, that's the answer. Political chaos, I'm sure there will be many more hot button issues for us to talk about between the time that we're recording this and by the time this episode releases, but our prayers will be with you all, our dear listeners and readers, and we thank you for your support. So, as always, please like, subscribe, leave a 5-star review. Your support goes a long way, by God's grace, to help our humble ministry, Lively Faith Ministries. You have been listening to another episode of the Lively Faith Podcast. Thank you, and God bless.